Good to go. Patrick, back to you again.
Yes.
Thanks.
By way of introduction, this is Wayne Reid. He leads our incident response team. And so the incident response, just for a little bit of clarity, it's not all incidents that the council might get drawn into. So, for example, if there was a flood, so our area of incidents are as they relate to environmental regulation, environmental breaches. So Wayne's team receives all of the calls from all around the region. It varies annually. It was tracking at about 2,000 calls annually, as you'll see in the report. And then what Wayne's team does then is triage them, prioritise them, physically go out and attend those ones that warrant that level of attendance, identify if there are breaches and resolve them. And you'll see, you asked about education previously, you'll see that education is one of the biggest tools, most effective tools used in Wayne's team. Again, we're very happy to, it's quite a basic report in front of you that just gives you a bit of an overview and some numbers. And we thought it, again, might be helpful for Wayne to just give an overview of an incident that his team got drawn into, which will give you a feel for that kind of thing, if that's helpful.
Yep, go right ahead, Wayne. Welcome.
Kia ora, good morning, everyone. Before I go into my case study, just had a look this morning at some stats for all of February. Just thought this might be of interest to you all. So, and this is quite typical of an average month. We had 141 complaints for the month. 29 of those were odour, 25 burning. And so discharges to air typically are our more, repetitive type complaints. So the case study I have today is something a little bit different, but we often get, or frequently get called to jobs by Fire New Zealand or the police, particularly when there has been a discharge of a contaminant into the environment, particularly with water. Unfortunately, this was, or fortunately, the truck driver survived this. But back in early November last year, our after-hours staff were called out to this significant event. So this is State Highway 1 between Turangi and Taupo, near the Bully Point area, which I think most people will be familiar with. Poor driver turns out was very tired and has fallen asleep. So what's happened is we've had a rollover. This is a B train truck and trailer unit, quite a big unit, and it's rolled over, and it was carrying, fortunately, as it turned out, mostly krill oil, fish oil. And if we go to the next slide, please. Along with krill oil, it was carrying 3 tonne of frozen meat and some electrical type items. Milk powder as well, a bit of milk powder. What was quite fortunate was that about 18 months ago, we put together this spill response plan. This came about through Tūwhare Toa communicating with one of the councillors here, identifying that there were a lot of resources around the lake, but they didn't appear to be talking to each other. And so our team put together this quite helpful plan, and which resulted in our 2 staff arriving at the scene, having made a whole lot of calls on the way down. And by the time they got to the scene, there was the booms up containing the krill oil. And that was important because we didn't know the toxicity of this krill oil and what effect it would have. As it turned out, one of our, I don't know if Mike's in the room, but one of our scientists had done a thesis on fish oil and was able to tell us that the toxicity was reasonably low, very low, and the best way to deal with it is let nature take its course. Wave action, sunlight would break it down pretty quick, and that's in fact what happened. So we were very fortunate that that was the predominant product on that truck. If you can go to the next slide, please. So this is a great drone photo. Now, we use drones quite a lot now with our attendants. Gives us a really good overview, and this was really beneficial for us to track the milk powder. And also, once again, we got significant advice on this, and this dispersed pretty quickly. Big part of our staff's response was looking into water takes in the area and establishing that their people's takes weren't compromised and what they were like and everything. So a lot of resource went into that. Next slide, please. Now, the road, State Highway 1, was closed for 30 hours. It was a particularly difficult site in that there was no shoulders on this road. There was, it took quite a long time to get, they had to get 2 mobile cranes in. So it was a significant closure, this one. So that's a recovery of the truck and trailer. So you may ask what happened to this this job. So the police, in this case, were the lead agency and took a prosecution, and I don't know what stage that's at, for careless use. So in this case, what was important to us, obviously, is the environment. We encouraged, motivated the owners of this firm to take responsibility for the discharges, and they engaged the services of the Department of Internal Affairs, which is the harbour master at Lake Taupo. And they did an amazing job, recovered 3 tonne of frozen meat from the lake. It took them quite a few days, which all at the cost of the company responsible. As a result of all this and taking a pragmatic approach, council hasn't taken any further action, understandably, in this circumstance, in light of what the police have done and them remediating to a pretty good standard. I think I've covered it all. Are there any questions?
Questions?
Yeah, if it wasn't krill oil or something more toxic, would you have different response?
Yeah, so everything is, we rely heavily on our scientists. So I suppose a common one would be hydrocarbons. And in a lot of cases, probably most people realise that I think it's a tablespoon of diesel can cover a tennis court and can look particularly nasty. But we take the advice of the scientists, and it's probably another case where you're case by case, but quite often with hydrocarbons, you can push it into the shore and use sucker trucks and stuff. But if it's of a bigger scale and the nature isn't helping us, we just let it take its course. It breaks up pretty quick with sunlight and wave action.
And if it was in a flowing water course, what we might do is start notifying downstream users and water takers with an abundance of caution until we know what it is, the contaminant. That's often the challenge in a situation like this, is that finding what it is that's been discharged is not necessarily immediate. And so particularly if it's in the middle of the night, there's all of these other emergency things that are in place in respect of other, emergency services. So these can be really complex and dynamic. And so our focus stepping into these is just focusing on that environmental aspect and the effects. But it's very case by case. Actually, if I could point out too, I think Wayne's probably just been a little bit modest with that contingency plan. So as Wayne drew together all of the stakeholders in the Taupo catchment who had resources, so this has included the likes of power companies who have their own booms and deployment boats, these sorts of things, who all expressed a willingness to be involved. And if I'm right, not long before this incident, there'd actually been an exercise run using some of these people. So I just feel like we're in a lot better place for events happening in this catchment than we were perhaps a couple of 3 years ago. So.
Fantastic result, sure. Brent?
Yeah, I really just wanted to reinforce what Patrick just said. Councillors, we provide a 24-hour service. So, and that's Wayne predominantly and his team, and some people from the broader directorate provide 24-hour service. So there were a number of Wayne staff that were down there for several days through the night, working long hours, and so there's a significant response capacity, but more so the preparedness capacity that Wayne in particular, by developing that plan, the people who deployed the booms had never deployed booms before, but they knew what to do because Wayne and his team trained them how to do that. And so whilst we have our individual responsibility as a council for things that we're responsible for, we do take a very broader picture around trying to bring people together. And this was a real example of how we can bring a whole bunch of people together to give a pretty good outcome to what was a pretty difficult situation. So on behalf of this committee and myself, congratulations, Wayne, did a great job.
Yes, thanks very much. And just, is it something that's being replicated around the country and other areas? Have you noticed?
I don't know. I'm not sure to answer, I guess. Are you aware of?
I don't, actually. I think the 16 regions do try and collaborate on certain things, but I don't know. Brent, you might have some knowledge of this because I don't, is that I'm not sure that there is a forum specifically around incident response. I don't think there is.
No, I don't believe there is. There's a forum around all regional councils, the Compliance Enforcement Special Interest Group, but I think this council is unique in a number of ways. You recognise the importance of this for our communities, and so you resource it because you know that our communities, when they see this sort of thing, really value it, and so that's great. You'll also hear later from Tracy around the work that we do supporting our rural communities. You might be surprised that some councils don't provide the level of support that this council does so that we can support our rural communities. So there's probably a number of things that this council does that is leading, and certainly in this incident response space, the work that Wayne and Patrick is doing is leading around the country.
Excellent. It's great to be leaders in this area. So, look, we'll receive the report. I could have a mover, please. Pamela. Seconder, Robbie. Thanks very much, and good day. Thank you, Wayne. Next up, Patrick, are you still there? Or are you off?
I am. This is last sitting alongside Evan Billington. This will be
Okay.
the last show and tell for me. So
Great. Back to you, Patrick.
Yeah. Introduction, Evan Billington, who leads our rural compliance team. So rural compliance, the sort of back, again, it's in the paper in front of you, but very broadly, we have the Waikato Regional Plan is really quite permissive in respect of activities in the rural sector. So it means that there's a heck of a lot of things that can be done out and about in our rural lands without a requirement to engage with the council and go through a consent process, as those activities probably would need to do in other regions. So what that does mean, though, is that somehow we have to resource and somehow keep some kind of eye across those permitted activities. So one of the very big areas for us, and has been for many years, is in the dairy effluent management side of things. And that's really just because of the scale of the industry. And you know, we're a vast dairy industry. There's a lot of players there. Because effluent management is a permitted activity, what we find is that because those farmers have not had to engage one-on-one with the council to get a consent, and then they've got that consent, you know, that license to operate, is that their knowledge of the rules around that they need to operate under, that knowledge can be quite low, despite everything that the industry itself has done, and the dairy supply companies and Dairy NZ and ourselves. So in some parts and with some farmers, that knowledge stays low, performance stays low, and we have the subsequent environmental effect. So Billy's team does spend a lot of time in the dairy sector, but we're also more recently have become responsible for starting to look at forestry operations under the National Environmental Standard for Plantation Forestry. So those are our two big parcels of work at the moment, but understanding that particularly with farm plans coming online and the other NES freshwater requirements, is that we're going to have to broaden our scope of what it is that we're monitoring in the rural sector. So flying overview of the last 15 years. And again, unless there was questions specific to the paper, we thought that Billy, as he's known, might just be able to present on a case or two that he's involved with.
Yep, sure, that's fine. Thanks. Thanks, Billy.
Kia ora koutou. Like Patrick said, Evan Billington, I'm the team leader for the Rural Compliance team. The case study I'll show you today relates to some forestry sites. So in terms of our forestry monitoring, the NES for plantation forestry is a regulation that the activities are carried out under. And when we are doing our monitoring, we're looking generally at the relationship between the harvesting activities, soil disturbance on the site, and fresh water, surface water generally. Two main contaminants being soil or sediment lost to water, and harvesting debris / into waterways. Yep. Next one. So our team has a compliance monitoring and enforcement function. So site one here was a clearfell harvesting operation involving a 60-hectare block of pines. It was not notified to the council as required by the NES for plantation forestry, and therefore it did not comply with the permitted activity regulations. They'd employed a ground-based harvesting and extraction method, and that included extensive tracking, as you can see here. On the left-hand side, near the bottom of the photo, is a stream, a reasonably significant waterway below the site. The stems were dragged downhill and across the stream via a temporary river crossing for processing and loading out on about the only flat area available. In terms of parties involved, there was a private landowner. It's a dry stock block. Private landowner had engaged a harvest manager who had done the harvest planning, engaged a harvesting contractor, and was responsible for marketing the wood. In terms of the site itself, it's called the soil classification as a yellow zone, so there are no real restrictions there. And the waterway was a rainbow and brown trout spawning habitat. Next slide. In terms of, I guess, the main risk factors, risk factor being that it was not notified to us and harvesting was completed before we'd become aware of it. So not notified, we hadn't been able to make an assessment and prioritise it in terms of our monitoring. Incorrect harvesting methodology used, so there's some real small margins between the cost of harvesting and marketing timber, and log markets go up and down, and so that puts some real strain on the industry in terms of how they log a block. So they'd gone for a less expensive option, which had increased the risk on the environment. Been the loss of sediment and sediment-laden stormwater from the harvest site into the stream, and that was significant, and that is an ongoing and has been an ongoing risk. They'd installed a temporary river crossing. The methodology they'd used there wasn't the correct one, and they had made a real mess of it. And the landing or skid site was in a confined area beside the stream, and as you can see in the photo, no controls in place to manage water runoff, and there'd been sediment lost to the waterway there, and harvesting debris had been, log processing debris left on the skid site, and no attempt had been made to stabilise the site post-harvest. So the key factors for us is really poor harvesting methodology and a lack of erosion and sediment control and stabilisation. Next slide. So this is site 2. This was a clearfell harvest of 17 hectares of radiata. Again, 4 farm woodlots. It was carried out under the permitted activity rules in the NES for plantation forestry. It was notified. They made notifications involving harvesting and earthworks in September 22. Harvesting and earthworks management plans that they submitted satisfied the requirements. Proposed harvesting method, again, it was ground-based, extraction with an excavator and a skidder, which was appropriate for this site. Earthworks plan included approximately 500 metres of haul tracks being constructed and the construction of 4 landing or skid sites for processing and loading out wood. Parties involved, separate landowner, again, a dry stock block, private landowner, the same harvest manager as site one, and the same harvesting contractor for that job. It was a green and yellow zone in terms of erosion susceptibility. And again, it was a trout spawning stream. Next slide. Risk factors. So this is a drone shot showing the area. This is after our intervention, and there had been some attempts to clean the site up. I guess the key factor was the proximity of a perennial stream that ran through the site. There was severe adverse effects on the environment in terms of in-stream ecology as a result of the harvesting method. The discharge of sediment and sediment-laden stormwater into surface water. And the site was in close proximity to the main branch of the stream and a state highway. The state highway is just in the bottom of the picture. Key factors here were a complete lack of care, poor oversight in terms of environmental management and the harvest management by the harvest manager, and the harvesting contractor had got in there with machinery and caused significant damage to the waterway. Just in closing, last slide. This is just an example, different site, but this is an example of where appropriate methodology can be employed. There's a hauler at the top left, a cable going across the valley, and you can see a machine working on the site. There's minimum soil disturbance, slashes less than the cutover to help with stabilisation post-harvest, and they're achieving full stem suspension, and so they're doing way less damage. There's a stream in the bottom of there, and they're falling away from the waterway. Thank you.
Cool, thanks, Billy. Look, just a couple of questions from me first. In regard to this sort of project, would the contractor or the landowner take the rap?
This is now with the investigations team. This
As an
particular site.
example.
Yep. It will be very circumstance specific in respect of, and that's where that real thoroughness that Greg talks about, because you'd need to know what were the conversations, what were the directions given, how much responsibility, if you like, was put from the landowner onto the, how much, I suppose, due diligence did they do? So we look at it like a bit of a pie. We look at everyone from the guy sitting on the machinery through to perhaps the landowner, and we just look at specific, who acted on what direction, what money changed hands, all of those sorts of things to try and determine culpability. And it might be a situation where a landowner has actually very, very limited culpability, or it may be that it's actually quite the opposite. It depends.
We've got Councillor Kneebone online, please.
Yeah, thanks, Chair.
Yeah.
Hey, Billy and Patrick, just curious, are you finding that these sort of bad practices tend to be the more smaller operators, but rough around the edges, or is it sort of, are you finding an even spread across the board of the bigger, more supposedly more professional ones? Because I'm hearing that you've sort of upped the resourcing in terms of monitoring some of these smaller forestry sites. Thanks.
So our biggest risk we're finding is in the small woodlots and remoter areas. The larger corporate forest owners and forest managers have more resourcing behind them, and we do monitor them, but in terms of non-compliance, we're finding, I guess, percentage-wise, more in the smaller woodlot.
Would I be right saying, Billy, that when timber prices go up, that's when everyone wants harvesting done at the same time. That's when it opens the door for the more cowboy element to step in. So
that's correct.
That's fair.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. No, thank you.
So, sorry, Chair. Just a couple of points, sort of more broadly around the forestry side of things. I think what you'll hear from me in the next few months is that I'm not sure that we've got our level of service right in the forestry sector and our resources. We've like, for example, we've currently got about 150 odd notifications. So what does that look like in respect of real-time monitoring on the ground to looks like? So the kind of things we're starting to look into is we think that there's some satellite technology that's going to be helpful to us to be able to tell us week on week what changes look like in forestry harvesting. So, and we want to be able to overlay that with what it is we're being notified about. So if what we're seeing on satellite matches what we've been notified about, that's helpful. If they don't match, that can drive our monitoring process. So we're probably not there yet in respect of our technology, use of technology, and our boots on the ground to be able to look at these things. But you might hear more from me later in the year about that, and you'll be aware. And I suppose there's just a real awareness of the impacts of slash nationally at the moment, and so we want to be in the best place that we possibly can to ensure that all of these forestry harvesting operations are being done in keeping with the NES, because that will reduce those sorts of incidents happening. So thank you.
Yeah, just in terms of the current picture you've got up as an example of good practice, it looks as though the slash would be confined within gullies, so it won't necessarily fall down. If you were looking not necessarily at the other site, but a steeper site that doesn't have those gullies, is there a need for riparian margins? How would you ensure that this containment can occur in some of the more difficult sites?
Yeah, so these forests were parted sort of 30 years ago when things were a little different, and plant afforestation activities now, their margins, setback margins from waterways are slightly larger, and there's some are putting in native planting, riparian margins, and some trees are left behind. However, most of it, they look at the methodology so they can fall it away and they can remove it. So with this machine, you can haul the logs off to a processing site and retain a lot of the slash there, and then it gets dealt with. A certain amount of slash needs to be left behind to help with stabilisation.
So there are methodologies that could be used.
Yes.
It's down to
Depending on the terrain, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, I'm interested in knowing what proportion of notifications you actually check in terms of compliance monitoring. Because that comes back to the resourcing you've got available. I understand that, but what proportion of actual notifications do get checked physically?
So when they come in, we look at a number of factors in terms of triaging them and where our risk lies, and some soil types and location and woodlots, we decide that we don't monitor them physically. And then if there are some risk factors where, such as these sites, then we do. Some are done by a contractor we employ in the southern part of the region. I don't have a percentage yet, but it's not. We're improving in terms of the resource we have available for it and the amount of putting some structure around how we're doing it. We will be increasing, but at the moment I don't have a percentage.
And it's not quite linear, because of course one single site, if there's issues, we may be going back to time and time again, which means we're not getting to other sites. So it's a constant juggle.
Yeah, and what proportion of the activity is driven by public complaints?
The site one that I showed you, that was a complaint that came in about the site. Another forester had driven past and thought, well, that's not right. The other one was from our own staff out monitoring. We get regular complaints. Wayne's team deals with some of those.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering if you could deal with this issue the same as how we have school operators, or how they're allowed to be involved in cleaning board drains and our own things. So we run a course that you're an approved contractor, and if you're not an approved contractor, you shouldn't be doing the work. So they can assess that they should be there harvesting or not, and And we can do that through our own forests that we have, especially in the Waihau, where we're deciding that some areas should be retired from pines and should be going into natives. And we could demonstrate how you should be officially farming pine trees. Thank you.
Yeah, so Billy and I are currently working on a compliance strategy. And so part of that will be to engage the industry themselves and start looking at, hey, what education opportunities are that can be run from within the industry. So it's got credibility. It's not the regulator necessarily doing that, but that stuff takes time, drawing those people together, and again, resource to be able to do that. So it's a absolutely work in progress. Yeah.
Just one more from me. In regard to permitted activity versus resource consent requirements coming down the track with the RMA reforms, do you expect to see a shift, a bigger shift towards permitted activities becoming easier, if you get what I mean?
Brent, I'm looking to you. I'm not sure I have a ready answer for that.
Yeah, I'll grab that and then have a concluding comment. Government is no doubt going to do an inquiry as post Cyclone Gabrielle. It will be interesting to see whether or not they think that needs to be a change in the regulatory regime. The regulatory regime changed a number of years ago to create the plantation forestry permitted activity. And it comes with conditions. It's not a free-for-all. It comes with conditions. But we can only monitor compliance with those things that we know are happening. One of those conditions is they let us know things. And you'll know forestry is often away from roads where people can see things. And so our ability to know what's happening is a challenge. And so that's one of the things that Patrick's been looking into around the satellite work, so that we can have more visibility of what's happening, so we can keep an eye on things. In terms of the numbers game, Councillor Clarkson, interestingly, notification is for anything over, I think it's a hectare, Billy. And so we might get 20 notifications of a hectare on flat land where there's very low risk, and then one notification of 20 hectares on some steeper land. And so Billy has a pretty refined prioritisation framework, and we employ contractors in different parts of the region as well to make sure that we look at the really important stuff. And so we can get information about the numbers that we're able to do, and Patrick no doubt will be bringing that forward to the council as we talk about the level of service that the council would like to have, because that will be important information for you. So we'll make sure that comes through. The final thing I wanted to say is that Billy's making sure that there's a shortage of people out there that have real skill around how a forest works. And so we're fortunate that we have one, and Billy's looking to build that knowledge within his team with that expertise. And in terms of on farm space, I just wanted to let you know that we have people like Billy, who actually is an operating dairy farmer as well, which makes sure that our people not only understand the rules, but they understand what it's like to be an operating dairy farmer, so that you can have confidence that we have a very good picture of what's good practice around the industry, is to make sure that we continue to drive that message of good practice throughout the industry. So thanks for your work, team.
Yes, thanks very much, guys. Billy and Patrick, and I'm happy to move that receipt of the report. Have a seconder, Robbie. Thanks very much. And next up we have Jack Blunden. Welcome, Jack.
So
And Amy, is it?
Yes, Amy's coming up.
Hi, Amy.
Amy's coming up with Jack. As I mentioned before, there's a bit of an overlap between Patrick's section and Amy's section. And those two sections work very closely together. But what we've found over the years is that there are slightly different compliance tools that are available to you when you have a bespoke relationship with somebody. So you have a consent that you've been through with that party, as opposed to when we're monitoring people who we may never have seen before. And so there are different opportunities in terms of helping them to achieve best practice whilst ensuring they achieve compliance. So Amy looks after that entire part of our business, and some of her teams do the compliance elements, one of whom is Jack, who has joined us in the last year or so from the Hawke's Bay. So hopefully all of your friends and family in the Hawke's Bay, Jack, are doing well. So I'll just have Amy introduce the team, the work that they're doing, and then Jack's got a particular report for you.
Thanks. Go right ahead.
Morena, koutou tātou, ko Amy Robinson, taka wingawa. I manage the regional consents team, and as Brent says we not only process resource consents, we do compliance monitoring with resource consents. As of July last year, we kicked off into a new structure where I separated the functions out to try and get more efficiencies in both areas of work. And as a result of that, we have now 3 compliance monitoring teams within the section. So Jack Blunden here, who's presenting the report, he generally looks after sort of 3 waters compliance, industrial discharges, industry type things, landfills and such like. Gareth Reid over, can you put your hand up, Gareth? His team monitor large earthwork sites, structures and waterways, disturbances, coastal, that kind of thing. And then Peter Searle, his team monitors water takes. He's about to pick up the Topol nitrogen monitoring portfolio and also marine farms. So everything sort of in between. So just for context as well, I guess for you, this committee has been very generous and supportive to our team. Last year we were given, the committee supported 3 additional monitoring staff to support the work that we do. So that's been very welcomed, and we've definitely been able to lift our game in terms of the effort that we've been undertaking. So I guess I'll just hand over to Jack now, who will give you an update on how the teams work and what the strategy looks like and exactly what it is that we do in terms of monitoring with consents.
Thanks, Amy. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you, and kia ora, everyone. Perfect. So as Amy mentioned, we've got those 3 consent monitoring teams, and between us, we've got around 12,000 resource consents across 2,000 different sites. And those cover a wide variety of activities, right through from our hydro and geothermal energy generation, development and earthworks, coastal structures, which is anything from coastal protection through to moorings, all kinds of discharges to air, land and water, land use and water takes and diversions, which includes a lot of our own flood schemes as well. The majority of our consents, as you can see, are water take and land use. So they make up the bulk of our consented activities, but probably a lower proportion of the work that we do. So the complexity of some of the discharges and coastal activities requires a lot more resource than some of the land use and water takes, which can be done a lot easier. We don't have resource to monitor all of our sites every year. So what we use is a prioritization system to identify the highest risk sites, or the ones that need to be monitored, to get the best outfit. Something I would like to highlight as well is that so the resource consenting system is user pays. So a lot of our work is recoverable through direct charges to consent holders and through fixed charges as well. Next slide, please. So with our prioritization, each of our sites will sit down at the start of each year and will assign a priority to each of our sites across the region. That priority is based on a number of factors, so it can include things like compliance history, whether they've been compliant in the past or not, and to what degree, the environmental risk posed by activity. So say a land use consent for a culvert would be much less than a discharge from a dairy factory. The public interest, so what do our communities expect us to be across? Likelihood of non-compliance. The location is also very important. So an activity in one area may have less effect than one that's happening in a catchment under pressure. And then we also take into account industry and operator reputation and history to help us focus on where we think our biggest issues are going to be. So every year we'll pick between 200 and 400 sites that are our must monitor. So these are ones that we can't afford not to look at. And then we'll have a second group of consents, normally around 300 to 600. Which if we have time, those would be the ones to focus on. So it really helps us identify which ones, where we need to be looking throughout the year. The other sites that probably make up about 50 to 60% every year. They'll be monitored ad hoc. So sometimes we'll get information coming through. We might get complaints or site reporting, or sometimes our officers will pick them up when they're in the area. But the prioritization system guides our business as usual monitoring. So that's how we work. And every now and then we'll get incidents or complaints or enforcement that comes through, and it gets bumped up the list as well. So we remain quite flexible to respond to those sites that change throughout the year as things change. Next slide, please. So our consent monitoring process is quite structured and it's cyclical. So it's ongoing as long as the consent is being exercised. It generally starts with information. So whether that's data, samples, or reports coming from the site, complaints or observations from other council staff is often really useful, or the public, or our own officers going out inspecting sites or following up on previous enforcement. Our officers will then undertake an assessment of that information, and that could be a desktop audit, some analysis. We might do a full report on the site, another field inspection to get a better understanding, or we may utilize some of our technical experts within the council, especially in our science department, who provide a lot of support when it goes beyond the expertise of our officers. And from that assessment, we'll move into an action. So what we're aiming for is no further action. We want sites to be operating as they're meant to, in compliance with their consents, and having no more than what the consent imagined in terms of environmental impacts. Quite often that's the case, but every now and then we'll have to take some further actions to make sure we're getting people to that standard. And that's anything from education, engagement, direct, but more specific actions. So you must do this or you must not. And then we have, of course, our fines, notices, and further enforcement right up to prosecution. So that pushes us into our outcomes area. So ideal, again, is looking for resolution. If there was a problem, we want to bring them back to that industry standard, best practice, and compliance with their consent. There may often be ongoing non-compliance of the same nature or different, and that can lead us to reviewing how we're monitoring, frequency, and what we're using to look after sites. Or we may even look at the consent, whether that's fit for purpose, and then enforcement again. And often that leads back around to information. Next slide, please. So I'll touch on the assessment of each site. So all of our sites that we look at each year are assessed using a national standard produced by the Ministry for the Environment. So this allows for a local, regional, and a national comparison across how sites are performing. We'll generally see around 50 to 60% of our sites in that full compliance area, maybe 20 to 30% in low risk, 10 to 20 in moderate, and then our significantly non-compliant sites, which are those are the majors. They make up a very small fraction of the total sites, normally around 1%, anywhere between 10 and 30 sites, and we've identified 9 so far this year. So they're a small fraction, but a lot of work goes into those to bring them back around. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to go a bit more into the significant non-compliance, which is the subject of the report. So it's generally for 2 reasons. There's been significant environmental consequences from their operation, or there's a very high risk of significant environmental effects occurring. So we can use it to communicate with the site and put across how important it is from our perspective. So it's not used that often, so it carries a lot of weight with it as well. And it allows us to be proactive, so we don't have to wait for the environmental effects to occur before going to this place. Sometimes significant non-compliance can be very obvious. You might get discoloration of the waterways, fish kills, or a really offensive odor that goes on for a year. But quite often it's something you can't see. So it's all driven by the data, and could be water quality and contaminant levels that are just unacceptable for a catchment that you wouldn't notice without some of the data and information that the sites provide and that our officers get out. But our goal with our monitoring strategy and how we undertake our work is to avoid this place. We want to make sure we're getting to these sites before they get to the point of a significant environmental effect. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to touch on our strategic approach. So our focus it's all on that early engagement, preventative monitoring. We can put our resource goes a lot further in that preventative space. We can get across more sites, more industries, and more operators more effectively when we're doing early engagement and education than we can on the enforcement end, which takes up a lot of resource. Our strategy focuses on those sites that are likely to cause environmental degradation, and that's based on all those factors we talked about before. And we're able to adapt and prioritize any issues that come up, and then importantly put processes in place to make sure that they don't happen again. And to do that, we use a full range of compliance techniques. So everything from those engage, enable, and educate, which are the upfront ones, right through to the enforcement. If we need to, we have those tools available. And what we're trying to avoid is that ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, the resource-intensive situations where the harm has already happened. We want to focus on avoiding it where we can. Yeah, so that was a brief, rapid overview to our consent monitoring process. So pass it back to you for any questions.
Thanks, Jack. Any questions from councillors? Anyone online? Any questions? Robbie?
How much remote testing are we doing? I believe we bought some little devices that float in riverways and creeks and that do real-time testing. How much of that are we using now?
So most of our sites where they have or where there's an expectation that there may be environmental effects, those sites will be monitoring both the receiving environment and their discharge. And a lot of those sites will require, they'll be alarmed. So they'll be notifying both ourselves and the site when there is a risk to that. Our team itself we don't have any sites. We do utilize other council locations. So we use the flood telemetry levels that a lot of our catchment management team operate, but nothing specific to our team.
I just understood we bought 4 little floating devices that can do real-time testing to put in waterways.
Robbie, sorry, Councillor Cookson. That you're probably thinking of the work that our environmental monitoring team, Ed Brown's team, do, the state of the environment monitoring work, as opposed to consent compliance monitoring. It's often when people talk about monitoring, we have monitoring in all parts of the council. I think what you're thinking of is some work that Ed Brown's team are doing, and Mike might be able to catch up about that later. But yeah, we certainly are doing a lot of in-river monitoring through our science team.
Ben?
You've identified there's 12 resource consents across 9 sites were significantly non-compliant. Without going into details, are they all now responding to compliance? Item 14.
Most of them are. So a few of those sites are some of our persistently non-compliant sites. So they're consistently getting that level over the last 2 to 3 years. And a lot of that is down to the type of compliance. So it's, I kind of put them into 2 camps: event-based non-compliance, where you may have one big whoopsie discharge and then that's it, or systemic. So these systemic sites take a lot to turn around, especially our wastewater systems and our landfills, where things start to go badly and it takes a long time to bring it back into compliance.
Are some of those moving to prosecution, or what's your steps through on that?
Yes, they are. Yeah. So where some of our other tools around education and our lighter enforcement hasn't worked, some of those are moving.
Yeah, I'm interested in a different form of compliance. So you've rightly talked about prioritising places which might likely cause environmental degradation, but what about consent conditions relating to offset, mitigation, compensation? Where does that fit into your work program?
Yeah, so that's site specific again. So sometimes I'll give an example in the Waitoa catchment. That is an under pressure catchment for nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. But we also have several really large industrial discharges that go into it that are high in those. Quite often the offset is not available in the area of the activity itself. So we have conditions across a few sites within that catchment that require them to offset both their nitrogen and their phosphorus discharges into the river. And they're allowed to do that within the wider catchment rather than just on their site, as well as having reductions, treatment processes that remove as much as.
If I can add to that, Councillor, it absolutely falls into the prioritisation framework, and which is one reason why we have the consenting and the compliance with consenting together, because often parties will go through a consenting process and there will be something that's really, really important to a party to that consent process, which ends up in a condition. And it's incredibly important that we monitor compliance with that condition, because people put a lot of effort to put their own thoughts forward through a consenting process, to then not have that one thing that they wanted that got into a consent to be ensure that there's compliance. So absolutely that falls into the prioritisation. And I'll give you one example. A particular party, it was actually an iwi partner, had wanted one thing in a consent process, and that was to be provided with something, some information as a condition of consent. And the party who didn't do that didn't think it was a particularly big deal. Well, we labelled that significant non-compliance. And so there's a bit of judgment in when you're talking about what is significant. And what was significant about that is that there was the one thing that they were promised that they were going to get, and this party didn't do it. And so that was followed up. And so it's absolutely a part of the conversation about how we prioritise things, because we need to respect all parties that were part of that consenting process. And the other thing that Councillor Cookson will be aware of, and Pamela will be as well, is that this team goes beyond just processing the consents and monitoring compliance. Where they recognise that there are challenges around compliance, they put in place training. And so Gareth, for example, over there, he's every, I think, 6 months, Gareth, they're running training courses around earthworks. What does good look like, so that people can be assisted to make sure that they know what good looks like in the water take space for a period. We were providing training about what does good look like around your metering and recording of data. So we find the right place around helping people be compliant, because at the end of the day, Jack can monitor more sites if more people are compliant. But one site, as I think Patrick might have mentioned before, Pukekohe, that site could take 2 staff members for many, many, many months, and which is why you'd have heard Jack say it could be between this number and this number, because something turns up and you'd expect us to prioritise our time on that, which means that we can't do other things. So Amy and her team leaders are constantly having to prioritise, which means we can't pin down an absolute number, but what they can do is say they will do as many as they possibly can, focusing on the highest priority work. Thanks, Dean.
Katarina, did you have anything to ask? Here. Okay. Okay, thanks very much. All right, thank you. We can, I think we can move on. Thank you, Jack.
Perfect.
Amy, are you hanging around? Yep, great, but we received that report. So can we have a mover, please? Ben, thank you. Seconded, Robbie, thank you. And we'll move on to the regional consent update. Amy Robinson, thanks.
Thank you. I feel very much the odd one out because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. So I know that you will have read the report, which is the update on recent consenting work from the beginning of the financial year. I wasn't planning on reading through it, although I can highlight some things if you would prefer. Otherwise, just happy to answer questions that you might have.
Yes, thanks very much. Any questions from councillors? Katarana?
So hello, Amy. My biggest take over the 7 years has been around water allocation. And I see since February 21, there's been 351 and decisions made 404. Now, I'm really, one of the things I've always said is that we should be kept up to date as much as possible around water allocation, because I still believe in some areas, especially of the Waikato River and some of its catchments, the water allocation that's going out is way and beyond the need at that time. And it's so correct. And if you look at what Hamilton City Council gave to Waterkia, all of those type of things. And I want to know, what are we doing around ensuring that the water allocation that we are doing going forward doesn't encroach into that area where they stockpile the thought of having it at all, because the little people are missing out in some areas, Amy, and having that deferred rate of waiting for 20 years before you can do that. I just like to have an update on where we are going around water allocation, please.
So you're absolutely right, that is a problem. People are essentially banking water that they aren't using. And so one of the approaches that we take is with the monitoring we do. So we understand how much the consent allocates versus how much they are actually taking. We then go back to those parties with those larger consents and sort of challenge, do you actually need this? Which is why you'll see in the report that there are a few that have actually reduced their take, which has freed up water for others. So it is something that is proactively monitored within the team.
Thanks, Ben.
Just the Buffalo Beach seawall, obviously that's topical at the moment with all the issues we've had. I see you've got a report coming back to the court on 17th of March. Have you got any updates you can talk to us about at the moment on that? Sorry, just on that, it's one of those issues that I know Warren gets asked about, Councillor Maher gets asked about frequently, about what is the role of the regional council compared with the district council, and a lot of angst around it.
Correct. So, so for a structure such as a seawall, it tends to straddle the line of mean high water springs, which is a jurisdictional boundary between the regional council and the district council. So this particular seawall does that, and so therefore it's going through a joint consenting process with both councils. So in terms of the mediation, since this report, we've obviously had a cyclone and TCDC's resources are being diverted. So our lawyer who's acting for us has proactively gone out to all of the parties and just to seek whether we can actually meet that date of the 17th of March. So from our perspective, we've done everything that we can, but we're just quite aware that TCDC might not be able to meet the deadline because they've got other issues. So through the mediation, the main issues in that appeal were the duration of the consent. WRC had imposed a bond condition, and the reason for that was because of the way that the group was structured. If there was ever any kind of non-compliance or abandonment of the structure, we wouldn't have any way of enforcing the conditions and then therefore potentially paying for any remedial works. So that's something that the appellant, which is the applicant, isn't very happy about. And then the other changes are really sort of smaller scale in terms of monitoring effort, management plans, all of that kind of thing. So through the mediation, we resolved most of the smaller things, but we're now still negotiating on the bond and the consent duration. So that sort of comes last. We've had to go out and get a bit more information about how a covenant might manage the issue and in terms of ownership, and therefore maybe not necessitate that need for the bond.
And were there emergency works that were undertaken during the cyclone? You know, is there a different process that occurs?
On that structure, no. So emergency works under the RMA can only be undertaken by a network utility operator. So that will be a roading authority, a district council, for example. Because this wall is a privately owned wall, there isn't that ability. However, within the consent they have, within the permitted activity works, they do have the ability to do some maintenance work. So my understanding is that during that storm, some of the upper layer rock was washed, both landward and seaward, and so they've been reinstating that back on top of the wall.
Oh, and the other one was the Te Rahia. I see that it's being appealed both by Ngāti Hako and by the applicant. Is that common?
Yes, often the applicant is one of the appellants because they aren't very happy with the conditions, and so they might be wanting some of the conditions to be changed. So that Environment Court hearing was supposed to be 2 weeks ago, but with the cyclone, Ngāti Hako in particular, most of them based in Paeroa, couldn't leave there where they were. So we're working towards probably a May hearing now for that one.
Thank you.
Yes, Robbie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is just around Waitoa, actually. In the situation where Fonterra's decided they don't want to supply water to the village anymore. So there's a situation where they're going to have to decide in the next, I'm going to move back from that mic, but in the next 2 weeks, if they're going to go sell into their own water through water services, or they're going to go into tank water. So just hopefully that we're all helping that community make a good decision of the best way they can move forward in that scenario, because I imagine we're involved in that as well.
So I'll grab that one for you, Amy. So we're not, as a council, so as a council, we're not specifically involved, but Fonterra are keeping us informed of the situation. So for the councillors' interest, you actually heard earlier when Greg and Patrick were talking about the Fonterra Waitoa site. The new Water Services Act and the obligations that come on water supply, people who are suppliers of water, that it's administered by Taumata Arawai, places some obligations upon all water suppliers, including Fonterra, as a supplier of water through to Waitoa Township. There's a real history to how that's come about, and it's not an activity that Fonterra wishes to continue with. There's business risk associated with that. And so they are working closely with Matamata Piako about what the future might look like. The part where we come in is there going to be further water allocated for that community. What we understand is that there is plenty of water within Fonterra's allocation for them to be able to provide the allocation. So wouldn't be such an issue with us because we won't be looking to allocate any further water. The challenge will be around how that water is then treated and then distributed around that community. And I think there's a community meeting this last night, and it's pretty challenging for all involved. And so, like I say, we're tangentially involved. They're keeping us informed, but it's not a matter that
Fonterra's been very productive, and they've offered the village tanks and everything, to tell you the truth. It's just the community deciding what they want to do best.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a challenging situation because it's not a particularly wealthy community either.
So just moving along, Amy, just a question from me. I see 351 water take applications lodged since 11 Feb 21. What type of applications are those? Is it the general household, or is it more a larger request?
It's an absolute mix of large and small territorial authority, industry, and also farm takes and households. So, yeah.
Are households required to put an application in to take water?
Brent will answer that because I'm not 100%
So, so the short answer is no, an individual household is not. But what you find sometimes, you might go up through up the Coromandel coastline. You know, there might be small communities of 50 households that get together to then have a take of water that services them all, but not an individual household level. Remember, some of these, the reason that there's such a large number of them, remember for a long period of time we had the queue. And so, because we had to deal with them first in, first served. And so, as Amy's identified in a report, through a lot of hard work doing exactly the things that you've requested of us, Katarina, the team have been putting heat on people that if you don't need your water, then give it back. And so we have had significant giving back through people either surrendering an application, withdrawing applications, partial surrenders across the board, so that we now have a situation where we, in the Waikato Waipa catchment, there is more water available to allocate than we have requests for water, which is a situation where we haven't been in for a long period of time because there's been quite the spotlight that's being applied. There are some pressure areas around the region, because I'm talking about the Waipa Waikato as a catchment as a whole. There are parts of the catchment where individual sub-catchments are at risk, and there are parts of the Hauraki, in particular the Piako, Robbie, that where there are significant over-allocation issues, which will be needing to be addressed through our upcoming regional planning processes around how do we deal with those situations, because where there's over-allocation, the council has to have an action plan for how we're going to get to a place of not being over-allocated over time. And the other thing that Amy's just mentioned about the Buffalo Beach seawall, the individual consenting processes are real learnings for when the council goes through the coastal planning process. Because ideally, ideally the consenting process is not the place to deal with these tricky issues about should something be there, should it not? How should it be there? How should it not? And the upcoming coastal planning process is a real opportunity to make these consenting processes clearer for people, because you can appreciate if you're one of those landowners, it can be a very, very significant cost to go through a consent process, particularly one that goes to the Environment Court. And so if you have very, very clear policy framework, that can give people a really good steer at the beginning. Is this a pathway that I want to head down, rather than all of that battle happening through a consent process in the Environment Court? So the learnings that Amy is sharing through to the policy team around how things roll out, depending on how the rules are written, is going to be quite important as you go through your decisions on the coastal plan.
And last question, is there a registry of all water takes in rural areas for households, etc.? For example, if a tank is driving along a rural road carrying diesel or whatever rolls, as we saw previously, discharges that into the upstream catchment, is there an alarm or alert system downstream of people that may be affected, or is it an unknown because people can just jump in and grab water as they like?
So we know where all of the consented takes are, but not the unconsented takes. So
because it's a permitted activity, is it to take a water for a household? Is that what you'd call it?
Yeah, so as Amy's saying, we know what we do know. And
Yep.
I think the question that you're asking is how do we go about finding out what we don't know? So there's there's a good example. I see Patrick standing up. And so I think I know the example he's going to talk about. So just recently, remember I brought to the attention of the committee an issue with a particular effluent treatment system on the side of the Kaimai Ranges. And we don't, so there will be some consented takes below that, but then there's a whole bunch that aren't. And so Patrick and his team then go through a process of how do we communicate with people? You'd have seen in my updates that we made sure that we found contact addresses or contact details for them all, and then set up an SMS system so that if something happened, we could SMS them all, something's happened. We don't know that everywhere. Where we can do it, we do that, and Patrick's up again, so he's obviously going to add to that.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you. All right, Katarina, last one.
I guess it's a bit like those dams that go in that no one knows about until they see it. Yeah, so I don't know whether this question is relevant to this area now, but wastewater treatment plants, how many of those wastewater treatment plants at the moment are still non-compliant as far as Waikato Regional Council is concerned within our local TLAs?
I wish you had have asked that when Jack was here because he would have known the answer. But I can come back to you and let you know.
Yes, the reason I asked, Amy, is that over the years I've been involved in quite a few TLAs who are trying to make their wastewater treatment plants compliant, and I wonder where we fit into that. I do believe we do push some buttons to make sure they do get them compliant.
So if I can add a little bit to that, because it was pre-Amy's time and with the previous committee, the previous EPC last triennium wanted to apply some spotlight to territorial authority wastewater treatment plants. In fact, territorial authorities across the board. And so for a period of about 18 months or so, we brought an update to this committee every 3 months on the status of territorial authority compliance with their Three Waters assets. Over that, when we did the final report at the last EPC of the last triennium, what was really pleasing to report was that there had been a significant improvement in compliance. There were still people who had work to do, but I think those that were here would have seen that we had issued, I can't remember how many abatement notices, how many of this, how many of those to get the traction. And it was, we actually saw it as a bit of a combined effort between staff putting pressure on and governance putting pressure on, that there was some very significant progress in compliance. There's still a ways to go for some, but I think the message that we had at the end of the last triennium was that people are moving very quickly in the right direction. Some of the government funding has helped. Places like South Waikato, they picked up $3.5 million from the government funding, which means that they can invest in doing more work more quickly. But if it is something that the committee's interested in, Amy will have noted that down as something that she might want to give you a bit of an update on at the next agenda.
It's not that we're interested. I think it's the fact that if they're not compliant, how do we keep tabs on their discharge into the water authority? That's all I'm asking about at the end of the day.
So very much as Jack had described, those sites have reporting mechanisms and our staff monitor all of that information that comes in. And so if they detect non-compliance, they follow it up. And so there will be sites that have received infringements that might be under an abatement notice to become compliant. So it is all very actively managed. And some of our TAs are fantastic. They communicate with us if they detect issues, whereas others aren't quite so proactive. And so that's why we have to keep an eye on them and just make sure that they're meeting those consented standards.
Okay, thanks, Amy. I'm happy to move this receipt of the report. For a seconder, please. Ben, all in favour? Carried. Thanks very much. Do we, how are you feeling, everyone? Are you okay? Shall we truck along? All right. Okay, next up, we've got farm plan implementation with Tracy Nelson from Rudd. Thank you. Hi, Tracy. Welcome. Welcome.
Sorry, kia ora. Look, I'm going to take the report as read. I don't have a lot to say today, so this is going to be really an introductory session and a chance for you to ask some questions. So as you'll know, farm plans are coming, and we've been saying this for a long, long time, but they really are coming now. So look, we know that PC1 is going to be in the Environment Court at the end of the year, but we've also got freshwater farm plans coming, and by all accounts and purposes, they will be hitting our region mid-2023. And while there's going to be an order of council for that, so not the whole region isn't going to be turned on at once, we're working through that with a group of people to work out what the best way for our region is going to be, especially taking into account PC1, because we don't want farmers to have to do 2 plans. So there's a number of obligations that the council has under PC1 and under freshwater farm plans. So things like templates, catchment plans, which also involve cultural values in that, certification, auditing system, registration tool. So there's a lot of things. And so I guess that's how this section came about. So I joined in May, and that's kind of when the section, I guess, was launched. And the big thing that the section is trying to do is to support the primary sector with all of these regulatory obligations that are coming. And how we are doing that is we are partnering with primary sector organisations, because we know that there are a lot of people out there that want to help farmers. And what we want is consistent messaging to those farmers. We don't want them to have to hear one thing from us and one thing from someone else. So what we did last week is we had an event, which we had a really good turnout. We had about 100 people. We had 20 people couldn't come because they were helping with the cyclone. What we did is we invited people who operated like the operational level. So people from Dairy NZ, the banks came, consultants, and it was all around bringing them along on the journey. So we kind of shared why the section was set up and how we're going to help. We talked about where PC1 was at and where the freshwater farm plans were at. We had MFE coming to talk to say where things were at from a policy point of view and how we, the council, are working with MFE to get the best outcome for the primary sector. We had Joe Finer, who's the CE of NZIPIM. So NZIPIM, organisation which has supports like farm consultants and the people that are really on the ground with farmers and who are going to play a big role in the system when it comes to freshwater farm plans. And by all accounts and purposes, the feedback we had was that it was a fantastic day. People were really keen to come into the room and be able to have a conversation around where it's at, how they can help, how we're going to work together. Of course, it raised a lot of questions, but we all acknowledge that we can't answer them, but we will answer them when we can. So look, I guess going forward, what I want to be able to share with you next time we talk is a bit of a rollout plan when we know what the freshwater farm plan timeline looks like. And just to report how things are going, where we're at in terms of not just the number of farm plans that we have, but the number of certifiers we're getting who are interested, the number of auditors who are interested, and also the engagement activities that we are doing with other people, so you can get a sense of that. So that's really all I want to talk about, but really happy for questions.
Okay, thanks. And the uptake's been, all of the interest has been pretty good, Tracy?
Yes, been
Not much kickback?
Not much kickback. People are actually really, really pleased and excited that the council has created this section. As Brent mentioned earlier, there aren't many other councils that have this section, so we're seen as a bit of a leader in this space, which I think is really encouraging.
Excellent. Ben?
Yeah, just a question. In the freshwater farm plans,
Yes.
do you have an idea of when they're likely to kick in?
July 2023, the first part of the region will get turned on, is our understanding.
And does that mean by July 2023 they have to have them done? Or
No.
is that the commencement process?
No, that's the commencement process.
And is it a 1, 2, 3 year process? How long is time before you have to have your farm plan done?
So they're working through that at the moment. What does submitted mean? And so we're still waiting to hear back from MFE. We've heard that the regs will be gazetted in April, so we will know more.
Because obviously you've got plan change 1 going through the court. So you're liable to get caught. 2 plans required.
So all the questions that you're raising are all the right questions, and are the questions that Tracy and her team have been working with the ministry on for some time. So we don't unfortunately control either of the two pens that are in play. There is a pen that government has, the writing the regulations. The regulations will be gazetted. They're about to go through to cabinet for sign off. They'll be gazetted probably in April. And when they're gazetted, that just means that they exist, that they have to be turned on, and that's called an order of council process. And an order of council then says where they turn on, and we are being told that they will be turned on in this region, as Tracy said, middle of 2023, but maybe staggered around the region, around the Motu. And when they get turned on, how long it might take. And all of those are things that we don't have the pen for yet, but we're peering over people's shoulders to get as much information as we can, so that then we can best plan what would it look like at the same time as PC1 coming out, what might it require. So there's quite a lot of work for Tracy and the team to try to make things as simple as we can possibly influence for our rural sector. But as you'll appreciate, it's quite an art when you don't control the pen of either of those two pens. So as Tracy said, what we're anticipating is that this committee will expect to hear from us every 3 months over the coming 3 years about how this is rolling out, because we have 10,000 rural landowners in the broader Waikato region who will be captured by the national regulations requiring farm plans. And so it's a significant piece of work, which is why this council has put together a team to support our rural sector as they deal with the obligations that sit, because the obligations all sit on the rural sector. Technically, obligations from the government on the rural sector, but we need to be there to make sure that they work.
Because, I mean, it's down to 5 hectare blocks. So as we.
Horticultural.
Yeah. So is there any idea of the cost it's likely to be per landowner? Because obviously some of this stuff is complex and you couldn't necessarily draw it up yourself.
Tracy answered the question. Again, really good question, and all the questions that Tracy and her team are working through. How can we? Because remember, at the end of the day, it's the rural landowner's obligation set by the regulations. But what can we do to help them meet their obligations in the most efficient and cost-effective way as possible? Which is why this council has invested in this team, so that we can help that sector. Because at the end of the day, it's their obligation, but we want to help them. Yeah.
Excellent. Katarina.
Tracy, hello. Been asked a couple of questions, but I've been involved with PC1 for a long, long time, and from almost day dot, farm plans were started back in those days. Your paper is calling farm plan implementation. So back then, what happened to all the farm plans that were put together back then? And because I do know there was big conversations between Waikato Regional Council, Frontiera, about having a templates that was manageable between both of us. So I hate to think this is new, I really do. And I like to believe that we, over the years, have helped so many people to do a farm plan. What has happened to those?
So I don't know what's happened to the plans, but I do know that MFE have been working really, really closely with all the existing farm plan providers out there. So that's Fonterra, that's Balance, that's Beef and Lamb, that's us, looking at how we can align the freshwater farm plans, because, and Ben, this will help answer your question, I think. They want to get rid of as many barriers as they can so that people can get on the journey. And my understanding, there has been a lot of work, especially with the Tiaki plans, open country dairy. We were involved in the pilot project, looking at the alignment so that those plans are not wasted, and also recognizing that a lot of farmers have done a lot of good things, and we want to be able to recognize that.
Doesn't actually tell me what happened to the plans all those farmers were starting way back in those days, because I can imagine that they did a lot of work back then. And if implementation is what this paper is about, then some of those plans should be way over date to be implemented if they haven't done it already. And so I guess I just wanted to understand, we got June 23 to make them start. Some of the farmers have been on them for over 5-10 years. They have already worked into some of them. So I'd like to believe that we haven't stopped offering those farmers who have already got a plan to make sure that they don't have to go backwards and rejig what they've done up to date. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely, councillor, and governments recognise that. So when it may very well be that if you had a farm, or Pamela's farm, say, you have a farm plan already, it may
In
be
2015.
it may be so close to the obligations that come from the regulations that there's very few tweaks that she needs to do to have a compliant farm plan. And in terms of implementation, fundamentally what the farm plan system is about identifying the key things in a catchment that are of concern, identifying the key risks that happen on a farm that might contribute adversely to those key elements of a catchment that people are concerned about, and then actions to take to address those risks. And those that have already got a farm plan have probably already identified risks and have already completed a whole lot of actions. And so it's not starting again. So for those that are a long way down the journey, this will be one of the challenges that we're having with government, is to try to make sure as easily as possible those people that are 90% of the way down the journey aren't encumbered, but there's a system that's going to bring on those that are maybe at the beginning of the journey that need to have some additional actions on their property to address risks. So, and that's a real challenge, and Tracy and her team are well up for it.
Pamela?
Yeah, just on that, as we did our farm plan back in 2015, I think first of all, the idea of these farm plans is they are not a static one-off. It is an ongoing thing. So we've gone through ours, we've reviewed ours formally 2 separate times since then. And so as you move through the items that you've identified the first time, you say, yes, we've made progress on that, but with this review, here's some additional things we might like to incorporate. Or maybe there's additional call for additional measures, right? And I think that where the challenge is, I suppose just to address your question, what I'm saying is that those farm plans, my understanding of it would be that those are still in place. Those are still valid for the intent that they were originally entered into. I think the challenge here is that with subsequent conversations, particularly at the central government level, we get additional ideas of what we might add to it. And maybe we go from a freshwater farm plan to an integrated farm plan. And how much are we going to stick into that farm plan? And so that's where some of the challenging conversations, I think, are happening, both from a regional government level, but particularly feeding into central government. It's helping them to understand the complexity that they might be adding. And the challenge we do have is that the farm plans that were initiated when PC1 started, that was to align with the intent of PC1. Freshwater National Policy Statement obviously adds some components. And so it's about how do we take what farmers have now and do those additional tweaks that are going to be required once our area, or once our region or the areas within our region get turned on in terms of the rollout. I think that we continue to have those conversations with the ministry around where the challenges might be. But the intent, what I see is that the intent and the willingness is there, both in terms of the support that we offer the rural sector, but also I certainly see engagement from farmers that I interact with, that they see this as a process that they know is good for the industry and good for the environment, and they're appreciative of what this council does in terms of providing the resource and the support to help them.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm just making sure that the council, the staff have enough capability of dealing with that amount of information coming in, because on a quick assessment, it'll be about 12 a day if you worked it out on an average coming in every day for 3 years. So just making sure that you'd have the capability of dealing with that much information coming in every day.
When you say that much
Well,
information.
if you got 9,000 or 10,000 landowners and they're all got to do farm plans, if you work it out over 3 years, that's about 12 a day.
So maybe,
Yeah.
maybe Tracy can answer that question, because the practical reality is it's not this council that prepares the farm plans.
No, I'm not saying
Um,
it, but you'll be assessing.
Oh, not even that.
Oh,
Tracy can
okay.
explain how that will work.
Okay.
So what will happen with the freshwater farm plan, a farmer will create a plan and they can either do that themselves, their provider might do it, it might be in a workshop setting, you know, there's lots of different ways they can do it. Then they need to submit that farm plan, and they don't submit it to us, they submit it to a certifier. Now, a certifier is someone that has been through a national accreditation program, which Assure Quality has won the contract for that. And then for a certifier to work into a region, they have to go through a regionally endorsed training program. So that's what we're trying to develop as well. So then they get the tick that, okay, they understand the region, they understand the needs. Then that certifier will make sure that the farm plan's okay. Is it meeting everything? And then information will get put into a national data platform, which I'm not an IT person, but you know, we had a meeting about it yesterday and it sounds all good. And then the farm plan will need to be audited. And again, the auditor goes through a similar process as the certifier, and then that information will come to us. And I guess then that will be up to Patrick and his team to go, hey, these people aren't doing what they're meant to be doing, or oh, these people haven't got a farm plan yet. So that's not on us, which is good, because as you said, that's a lot of people that would have to come through, and we don't have that capacity. Brent, is there anything you want to add to that?
Explain it really well, that the system is being set up so that it's almost independent of us, that it goes through a certifier, it goes through auditors, but we're going to need to make sure that the integrity of the system works to achieve the outcomes. And so as part of that, we will develop a compliance strategy, and that'll have a number of different elements to that to make sure that the integrity of the system works. Of course, we're at the stage of the developing of the farm plans, and the compliance strategies will come, but that's not the primary focus today. Is supporting all the farmers to get a farm plan, and then get the right actions, support them to do the right actions, and then we'll have strategies around, because invariably there will be people that don't play ball, and we'll have strategies around getting them back on track.
And the good news is these are templates available to help
Yeah,
those
but
that-
just in that for us to change catchment quality is not going to come too quickly, though, because it's got to go through all that process. Then the information's got to come back, and we've got to find out who is actually the polluter in that catchment.
I don't think that either this council or government is seeing farm plans as the final solution for all water quality related matters. What they're seeing is it's a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And so that's why you'll see PC1 and the national regs are seeing farm plans as a piece of the puzzle, and there's going to be other work that needs to happen along the way to achieve the water quality objectives that this council and the government has. But this is a piece of the puzzle. And the feedback that we have from government, from their contacts with industry, is that they're very supportive of a farm planning approach. And so it's one of the things which helps engagement, knowing that on the industry are keen on a farm planning approach, and success of this for our farmers will very much be dependent on all elements of industry working together. And that's a key platform of the work that Tracy's doing. Just the same way when Wayne was here before, he brought a whole bunch of people together to achieve the goals around taupo. Tracy will be hoping to corral and bring all those people together so that we can collectively have farmers have good farm plans, good actions, take action, get the water quality improvements.
Okay, last question, Ben.
Yeah, will regional council be able to indicate an area that it thinks is a good place to start? If these are being turned off around the region, would, for example, Taupo, given all the work's been done there, be an ideal place to test this stuff? And would we be making a recommendation, or is that the central government making that decision?
So, short answer, yes. So we will be giving them some information about what we think might be information they might like to give to the minister to help that minister make decisions. So the sorts of things that you would think about is that there's 8,000 to 10,000. You want people to be engaged. Well, people are a bit more engaged in the Waikato Waipa area because they've been through 10 years worth of Plan Change 1. Maybe there's some time before the hauraki, because we're going to go to the hauraki with our plan changing. And then within PC1, there's different prioritizations around different catchments. And so we'll be making sure that they have all of that information and then the numbers of farmers in different areas so that we can influence them as best we can about what will be an implementable best chance of success rollout. That's information that we're putting together right now to feed into them so that they can feed that to the minister.
Thanks very much, Tracy.
Thank you.
You're free to go. And could we have someone move the receipt of the report, please? Ben? A second, Pamela, thank you. And all in favour? Aye. Excellent, carried. Right, next up, we've got Summary of Ecological Monitoring of Streams 2018 to 2020. And Dr. Michael Pingram.
So if I could just make a couple of opening comments for the committee as you probably haven't seen it just yet, have they, Mike? But Tracy will be having workshops with the full council on our State of the Environment Monitoring Report. And that's going to give you an overview of a significant piece of work that our science team have been doing over the last few years. What Clyde and Katarina have thought would be good for this committee over the course of this year is to take 2 topics from per meeting from that State of the Environment report and go into a little bit more detail so that this committee gets a little bit more detail around 2 topics. And so by the end of the year, we'd have gone through 8. And so that's how we're sort of mapping out the year. And so you'll all know Mike Scarsbrook, who leads our science team. And so the first 2 topics today, I'll leave for Mike to introduce.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Brent. Yeah, I'd just like to introduce Michael Pingram. So Michael's been with Council for 8 years and has recently moved into the role of team leader for water quality and ecology in the science section. So I'll hand over to Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Cool. Well, thank you for having me here today. Yeah, kia ora, I'm Michael. I'm a freshwater ecologist by background, and today I'm just been asked to give a bit of a summary of some of the state of environment monitoring that we've been done with regard to ecosystem health of streams. So the results I'm going to present today come from our Regional Ecological Monitoring of Streams program, or REMS. And I'd just like to acknowledge the people who also co-authored the technical report that we've recently completed. So I'd like to acknowledge Bruno David, who is a fish scientist who's no longer with Council, but also particularly Nicole Squires and Josh Smith in our environmental monitoring section, who essentially coordinate the day-to-day of the program. Thanks, next slide. Cool. So I thought it'd just be good to just sort of give an indication of what it is we're actually monitoring. And so the program is designed to monitor wadable streams. And so I guess these are streams where you can access the majority of a stream reach using standard techniques, but also between about 0.8 and a metre depth and sort of maximum depth. The streams themselves, our sites cover a range of sites from native forest all the way through to intensive agriculture, and we also have a range of forestry and urban sites in the network as well. So we cover a range of land uses and pressures. So that the size or the scale of the resource that we're trying to infer ecosystem health for in this region is around 15,000 kilometres of wadable stream on developed land, with about a further 6,000 or so kilometres in native forest. Not part of this network, but I guess it's just also worth mentioning that in terms of larger non-wadable rivers, so these are These also range in quite a large size range there, but there's around another 3,000 kilometres of waterways, which we don't presently monitor as part of this program. Thank you. Next slide. So I thought I'd just in terms of what we sample and why we sample it. So what we sample as part of the program is essentially the aquatic life that is present in a stream. And the reason we do this is that these animals essentially live in streams for either part or all of their life cycle. So as you can imagine, a fish will live in a stream, maybe not the same stream reach for its entire life, whereas a range of aquatic invertebrates will spend their juvenile years, their juvenile time in the aquatic environment, and they will hatch and become terrestrial and live in the riparian zone or thereabouts as adults. And aquatic life is basically found from the mountains to the sea in our stream network and everything in between. And quite importantly for what we're trying to achieve, they respond to environmental conditions. So they respond to not just the local conditions in the stream environment, but also to what's happening upstream, and particularly in the case of fish, to what might be happening downstream. So they're a key indicator of the ecosystem health of a system. They're also incredibly important in stream ecosystems, as you can imagine. Aquatic invertebrates in particular are really important for processing organic matter or grazing plants, eating leaves, and of course they are food for larger animals such as fish. And when we put all the different types of animals present in a stream together, they provide an integrated measure of a stream's ecological health. And what we mean by this is that the life that you find in a stream at a given time reflects all of the conditions leading up to that moment in time. So the weeks and months prior to you taking your sample have led to what is present and how much of what is present. And then this information can be turned into what we call metrics and indices, and this is a way of condensing all that information to share it or analyse it or look at it through time. Next slide, please. So in particular, what we look at in our streams is we go out once a year in the summer. It's usually when these streams are more accessible, but it's also when there is a certain state, particularly for invertebrates, it's when the adults are actually, or the nymph stage is actually there, so we can actually sample it effectively. And so we collect a macroinvertebrate sample. That's the third from the right. That's Nicole disturbing the substrate of a stream, and the invertebrates are essentially disturbed and the flow of water carries them into the net. We then do, at most of the sites as well, we do a fish survey, and this is predominantly electric fishing surveys, and that's also there on the bottom right. And we also do net-some sites as well. And then to complement these samples of what's living there, we have a look at the in-stream and riparian habitat, and we use a number of measures to do that, including fine deposited sediment. We also look at the shade, as this is a key regulator of in-stream processes. And
sorry, Mike, just on this picture, what's measuring a rock to do with anything?
So that gives us an idea of the substrate size, so the particles in the stream. So it's like cobbles and boulders and gravels. And what we're interested in there is that, particularly with the smaller size fractions, so the fine deposited sediments, this is your sands, anything sort of less than about 2 millimeters in size. When you have a large proportion of those, they go into the gaps in between the larger rocks, and it's those gaps where the invertebrates in particular and the fish as well are living. So what we're kind of, it's sort of to provide a bit of a comparison between sites, but the size fraction we're particularly interested is the really, really fine stuff. No, you do get a bit carried away, they get a bit finicky. Yeah. We also pick up the rocks to look at the periphyton that's growing on. So this is, it's a plant, but it's this with the algal growth and things as well. So we'll pick up rocks and look at the cover of the rocks to see how much algae is present. And in some of our more low gradient streams, which do have finer sediment beds, so they do have sandy or silty beds, we get aquatic plants. So that's you can have submerged aquatic plants and also all those sort of willow weed and things like that grow in and around stream margins. So it's a fairly comprehensive reach scale assessment that we do of the life and also some of the other, I guess, factors that dictate what might be living there. Thanks. Next slide. So this is just kind of to give a quick summary of the idea behind some of the ecosystem health metrics, and just focusing on macroinvertebrates here. A similar principle is used for the fish communities, and this ties into where the MPS asks us to report and look into in particular. So the Macroinvertebrate Community Index, or MCI, as it's commonly called, is probably the most widespreadly known. And it's kind of based around the idea that different invertebrates have different tolerances to environmental stress. So on the left-hand side there, it's my left, we have sort of caddisflies, stoneflies, and mayflies. So these are typically associated with nice, clean running water, fast water, lots of oxygen, good conditions. And then we have ones on the other side, which are some of our snails and worms and chironomids or bloodworms. And these are sort of associated with sites that might be under more stress or might have more pollution or be, these are more tolerant of impacts essentially. So by putting together that whole group that are present or not present at a site and their abundances, you can start to look at what the overall picture of a site's ecological health is based on what's living there essentially. Thank you. Next slide. So I'll go through this one reasonably quickly. So I guess where do we monitor? So the stream sites that we have are essentially spread from across the entire region from north to south. Some of the sites have been running for over 20 years. And I guess as part of the whole network, we have around 250 sites or stream reaches that we survey.
Just to interrupt you there, Mike, the bigger one in the agenda differs from this one here. In regard to some of the points.
Oh, yep.
So just, yeah.
Oh, yep. Sorry. So this one's slightly out of date. So the one in the agenda is the correct figure.
Oh, this one's in the agenda is the correct one. Okay, I'm just looking at the fish sites, fish and invertebrate reference.
Oh, yeah. So what's happened there is so we had some of the sites come into the network for slightly different specific purposes, and so so when they were developing the fish network, and they found a different set of what we call reference or native forest low impact sites, and this is because to look at the effects on fish community, connectivity and barriers are a really key function. So some of our invertebrate sites were too far inland for that for that principle not to hold. But what we've done is, because we sample everything at every site, in the report we've incorporated all the sites that we had.
So all these sites with the triangle and the circular, like you're looking at fish and invertebrates in all of those sites, also the randoms. Yep. Thanks. Carry on.
No, that's all good. I'd missed that one. Sorry about that. So we have we break our sites, I think in the report it says break our sites into some different sampling frequencies. And the results I'm going to talk about today primarily come from the 180 sites that we sample on a 3-yearly rotation. And these sites are the random sites. And these are sampled, or the network is essentially designed to be both spatially balanced throughout the region, but also be as unbiased as we can make it. So the sites were selected by an algorithm essentially. They were vetted to make sure that they were the types of streams that we were looking for, and that in many cases they actually existed. But that's the idea behind that network, and one of the beautiful things that allows us is to make statistical inferences of the region at large. So it's a snapshot of what is there and how's it shaping up, rather than asking a very specific question around what might be happening at a site or a catchment. We do have another set of sites that we go to annually, and these include the native forest sites that form part of that network, including those fish reference sites. And we look at those to get an idea of what change might be happening in some places. And I guess we sample these sites to give an idea of the current condition, but also to look at change through time. And you can envisage the random sites almost like a population survey. I hate to use the analogy, but it's a bit like a phone survey, if you like. You can go out and you can sample, and you can come back to those surveys, and you can either go back to the same callers, or in theory, you could go back to different callers if you like. And then by looking at that whole range of things at sites, we can start to put the different variables together to give an idea of what things might be happening at the same site that might lead us to some conclusions as to what we might need to address. Thank you. Next slide. Cool. So I need to speed up. So the National Policy Statement for Freshwater specifies 3 macroinvertebrate metrics that we need to look at in particular. And these are the Macroinvertebrate Community Index, which is a present absence index, the QMCI, which is its quantitative sister, and an ASPM, which is an aggregation of the same data set calculated differently. So all these three metrics come from exactly the same data set, but they look at it from different perspectives. And the take-home message here, I guess, is that based on the random network, we have a pretty large proportion of wadable streams in the region that fall into this high category of high concern, or a D band. It's also worth noting that this condition isn't evenly distributed throughout the region, and different parts of the region have, I guess, a greater proportion of D band, and also different sort of median condition. Next slide, please.
Just on that one, it's interesting to see that the Coromandel is green in some and red in others.
Yeah, so in the Coromandel, that's the purport. Yes, so as yes, kind of alluded to, the metrics kind of work slightly differently. So, for example, the QMCI, the quantitative metric, where you have lots of tolerant taxa present, but you also have some sensitive taxa, the abundance of those tolerant taxa does drag the scores down. So it's that function of abundance or relative abundance starting to play. So I've presented our regionally specific indicator here, and the main reason is that the MFE indicator is they're still ironing out some nuts and bolts with regard to how we should calculate it. But we've basically had this indicator in play for around 15 years, I think. And I guess the take-home message here is that around if we look at both the C and the D bands, around half of the region probably has some impact from some stressor or other. It's important to note that around 5% of the sites are estimated to have no fish naturally. So that's where we've created this other sort of E-band. So some sites we have a model which predicts what might be there. And when we don't find fish there, we sort of make an assumption that that is true to the case, because we do have some reasonably significant natural barriers to fish throughout the region. Once again, it's variable between FMUs. And I'd just like to point out that while connectivity is a really key driver of this particular metric, it's not the only thing that fits into how it's calculated, and hence the picture of koi carp and gambusia on the slide. And in some of our lower gradient catchments, particularly in the low Waikato, we do have some pretty widespread invasive species as well.
Do you have any, in some of these areas, it's 20 plus years of observation. Do you have anywhere there were fish previously and there aren't now?
So the fish network kicked off in 2012, so it's 20 plus years for the macroinvertebrate monitoring, and so we've got a little bit less for the fish, but I'd have to check with Josh, he'll know that.
Thanks.
Next slide, please.
And we've got Stu online. Stu, did you want to
Oh,
add something?
thanks, Clyde. Hey, just a quick question, Mike. Different parts of the region, i.e., say maybe pumice soils versus the Waipars soils, do different streams recover at different rates depending on the nature of the soils and that end up, the sediments that end up filling in all those little cracks between the rocks and that sort of thing? Do you find that?
Yep, I would expect that would be the case.
Yeah,
definitely.
Okay.
So there's definitely a catchment sort of geology effect, and I'll just touch on that. That's a nice lead into this slide, actually. So when we actually look at habitat, one of the key things we look at is fine deposited sediment, which we just sort of touched on earlier. And one of the reasons I've focused on silt in this report is that it's more likely to be derived from human activities, whereas we do have a number of streams that will be naturally sandy bottomed or pumicey bottomed or even clay bottomed, and so didn't want to get too carried away by painting this sort of massive picture when we haven't bored down to that level of sort of what might be the natural substrate at a site at every single site. So we do so habitat, I guess, is pretty all encompassing, and we do a qualitative assessment which looks at the riparian, and this comes from Cawthron, and it's a nationally applicable assessment. We'll probably make an appearance in national stuff at some point, I would imagine. And but a large focus of that is around both the abundance of certain habitats, but there's a large emphasis placed on riparian condition and also deposited sediment in that assessment. So as you can see, there is a huge extent of highly impacted habitats when you look at it as a whole, but there are some key variables which do tend to stick out. And the main one of those is that silt cover. So we can see in the bottom left-hand plot there that we have a reasonable proportion of streams which so the red is more than 40% of the bed, and this would be sort of considered a fairly major ecological impact. But even in that C-band box, around 20% cover by silt is actually still a really sort of key threshold. And there's lots of literature, both experimentally and from, I guess, field observational studies, which shows that at about that amount, you start to see quite a significant change in the macroinvertebrates in particular that live at a site. In terms of some of the other MPS attributes, which we don't measure in the MPS sense, but they're sort of presented here, I guess, for information. Periphyton cover, we don't tend to see widespread periphyton issues at the sites we monitor, bearing in mind that these are largely smaller streams. But we do tend to see quite a large proportion of streams that have lots of aquatic macrophytes. And I guess this reflects that we have a lot of sites in low gradient, lowland catchments. And I guess it's important to note that you don't tend to get lots of aquatic macrophytes in your stony bottom streams, which is where you tend to have periphyton growth. Can we hit the button 5 times? Some pictures in there. Next slide, please. That was just some pictures of they represent. Yeah, one more. Next slide. Also, I'll just finish up. So I guess the key findings are that a large proportion of the wadable streams in the region are likely to have some form of ecological impairment. So I guess even in that MPS freshwater space, we've got quite a bit of work to do, I guess, as we work through reviewing the regional plan and implementing action plans. Fine deposited sediment is a really key driver of both fish and invertebrates that live at sites. And so I guess from an ecological point of view, it's a really important thing to be considering. But also factors, particularly for both fish, connectivity is a really key issue for our migratory species. Riparian cover is another one where actually having shade of the stream bed will help to regulate a lot of ecosystem processes, and it's really important for things like temperature and dissolved oxygen. And nutrients are always quite an important driver. I just wanted to note that the estimates from the most recent report are actually statistically similar to when we first kicked off the probabilistic random network in 2009. So in terms of regional extent, we've seen very little change. There has been change at some sites. Some sites have got better and some sites have got worse. But at a regional scale, they're very, very similar estimates. So I guess the next steps that we're working on is we obviously have this amazing data set with that we can leverage more out of. And one of the key things we want to do is investigate this in more detail to find more diagnostic metrics. So the MCI and QMCI can be slow to respond. But if we can find, I guess, use that data in a more detailed way to find a better understanding of how things respond to pressures and interventions. And this is, I guess, is a two-edged things. We want to be able to look into change where it's going, where things might be getting worse. We want to be able to act quicker, but we also want to be able to tell people when things are getting better as early as we can. And I guess one thing that we don't have we've done quite a bit of work on as a council with a lot of our research partners in the past over the last 10, 15 years, but that's looking into ecological indicators and how we might monitor our larger non-wadable rivers for ecosystem health. That's me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Ben.
Oh, it's just your point number 30. Estimates of ecosystem health at regional scale have remained fairly stable since. So that's overall a good degree in the sense that it haven't got worse than overall. You're talking about fluctuates, but we're not seeing major significant regional decline.
Yes, you could say, yeah, so the extent hasn't changed, but clearly we have quite a large extent of aquatic situations as well. But yeah, it doesn't appear to be getting worse.
Karina?
Kia ora, Mike. So last triennium, Waikato Regional Council and Tūwharatua Māori Trust Board agreed for them to do their own monitoring. I haven't seen anything on that to see how it's going. Have we done any extra work to help them along? You know, can you fill me in on some gaps on how that is going? Because I guess we will take what comes out of that as maybe anybody else who might want to go into it, but having a report from how that is working, whether it's good for us or bad for us or blah, 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 would be a great idea to ensure that we have a pathway forward if anybody else wanted to do that.
I have to say I'm not probably the right person to ask that question.
I'll grab that. And so remember earlier on I talked about two key senior managers from the science team that report through here. One of them hasn't got reports here today is Ed Brown. So Ed Brown was one of the key people that was associated with that section 33 transfer of functions. And so Mike is feverishly writing down a note that that's something that you'd be interested to hear some feedback on how that's going, and we'll get Ed to be able to report back on that in due course.
Didn't expect much, but you know, we allowed somebody outside Roku to do this. I'd like to know how they're going, what update we might be able to give them if they need it, because we did say we'll do a lot of teaching them, monitoring them, blah blah blah, just to get a report and say, hey, is the tick box or not? Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I think really good idea because, as you say, there are others both within our region and also other parts of the country who are looking at what we did in Taupo as a potential a way forward for the future. So I think it's a really good idea. I'll go back to Ed on that.
We've got Bruce and then Stu online.
Yeah, so we actually got a very nice report from Tū Whātua Trust when we met with them, which covered off this issue of monitoring, and that would be very easy to find. Yeah. It's in our pack somewhere. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I believe it'd be good to come here too. So if it transfers from them to here, after all, we are the environmental performance group, and we can take a measure on our own about whether it works or not. Yeah.
Thanks, Katarina. And we've just got Stu
Oh,
online.
Yeah, no, thanks, Clyde. Look, Bruce has just answered it. That report's quite comprehensive, and it's in. If you just go into the Tū Whātua JMA agenda, which was only a week or two ago, it's all there. I can forward you the link if you want, Katarina. It's quite comprehensive, No need to reinvent the wheel here. Cheers.
Righty, just to summarise, Mike and Mike, out of A and D, A being best and D being poor, how are we doing? Like, how the state of the streams, do you think?
Could be better.
Pardon?
Could be better.
Right, and so C, D, B?
Well, I think it's very tailored to where you are.
Sure,
and the catchment land uses. I think maybe
feel free to open up a little. And Mike, just and the general trend, is it sliding?
So generally at sites, a good place to look at some of the trends would be on the LAWA website. I haven't pulled out the trend stuff. Still getting my head around that particular calculation. We essentially have a mixture of sites. Some sites do get better and some sites get worse. What we tend to find is that it doesn't always make sense either. So we tend to see that we have declining trends in some of our better sites when there's really no reason to do it. So, and then some of our other sites might be getting better. Yeah, I'd probably put us about, I guess the average condition is a C, so we could say that, but I think there's a very concerningly large proportion of C-band sites. But I think streams, water runs downhill, they're all linked together, and I think what it shows is that improvements and interventions need to happen at those scales that affect what happens downstream.
So we need to do more somehow. Thanks very much. Thank you, Mike. And Mike, you're free to go, I think, and I'll move to receive the report. Can we have a seconder, please? Robbie? All four in favour? Aye. Okay, carried. Look, we've got one more to go, so everyone's kind of hanging in nicely. And we've got Dr. Jonathan Caldwell and Mike as well. Yep, welcome.
Just to
and just to introduce air quality across the Waikato region, 2023. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. And just to introduce Jonathan, Jonathan's been with council for 16 years and has presented many times to EPC, perhaps in previous tenure chair. And I should have said that was Michael's first time ever presenting
well
to
done,
council.
Michael.
Yeah. So you hand over to Jonathan.
Jonathan, welcome.
Kia ora katoa. Thank you for inviting me to present today to you and give you an update on state and trends of air quality across the Waikato region. So next slide, please. And I'd just like to apologise in advance that unfortunately all my bullet points are clickable, so you may want to just click through them in advance. Okay, so although air pollution is a mixture of contaminants, it is PM10 that has traditionally been the main air quality indicator of focus. And PM10 refers to those airborne particles that are 10 microns in diameter or smaller. So they are inhalable, they can get into the lungs and cause those respiratory diseases. There is now much better evidence that PM2.5 is a better air quality indicator. These are the particles that are 2.5 microns in diameter or smaller, so they can get deeper into the lungs. When they get below 1 micron in size, those are the ones that can cross over into the cardiovascular system, so cause cardiovascular disease as well. Nitrogen dioxide is a respiratory irritant, so it also can cause respiratory disease. It is also considered another important air quality indicator. So together, PM2.5 and nitrogen dioxide contribute to most of our air pollution health effects in New Zealand. Next slide, please. So in New Zealand, we have the National Environmental Standards for Air Quality, which are the regulations that direct how we manage and monitor air quality in New Zealand. They were introduced in 2005. They were the first of the regulations or national environmental standards that sit under the Resource Management Act. They include 5 air quality standards for fine particles, namely PM10, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and ozone. But the standards don't at this date include a standard for PM2.5. The regulations also require regional councils to monitor air quality to assess compliance with these standards and also to ensure that any air discharge authorisations will not result in airshed breaches of these standards. There's also a regulation that requires offsets for industry who can produce significant effects on air pollution in polluted airsheds or where industry is sited close to a polluted airshed. So there's more restriction on those industries that have larger impacts on air quality. Particulate emission and efficiency standards are also required for all wood burners that have been installed newly installed wood burners since 2005, and these apply to any property that is 2 hectares or smaller. And so the regulations have put a big focus on PM10 as being the main air quality indicator for monitoring and management, and it has identified domestic home heating as the main source. Next slide, please. So in April 2020, the Ministry for the Environment consulted on some proposed amendments to the NES, the main focus being to introduce PM2.5 standards, which we haven't had to date. Most countries do have guidance and guidelines and standards for PM2.5. So it's looking at shifting our focus away from those larger particles to the focus on the smaller particles where there's a much better health evidence around management and monitoring. And the proposal is to base those PM2.5 standards on the World Health Organization guidelines. The amendments also are looking at introducing more stringent solid fuel domestic home heating emission standards. So these would apply not just to wood burners, but also any multi-fuel burner, which is capable of burning coal as well. So it requires a lot more stringent control on anything that those burners emit. The Ministry for the Environment indicated in late 2020 that the final amendments were awaiting the outcome of a concurrent review of the 2005 World Health Organization guidelines and also an updated health and air pollution in New Zealand study. Next bullet point, I think it is, or slide, yeah, that's it. Thank you. So the World Health Organization guideline updates came out finally in 2021, and we saw a much lower threshold set for PM2.5 and nitrogen dioxide. The Health and Air Pollution in New Zealand study update also came out the year following in 2022, and identified a strong association between the health impacts in New Zealand with exposure to PM2.5 from home heating and nitrogen dioxide from motor vehicles. So it's indicated that we still have that concern around home heating as being an issue, but it really has put a lot more focus on transport motor vehicles as well. And so finalisation of the amendments, however, remains on hold now due to the RMA reform. So we had some discussions recently with Ministry for the Environment. They're still looking at how a lot of these national environmental standards will sit under the national policy framework. So they're still grappling with that. They don't want to release the amendments to the NES until they've done that. So we're still in a sort of holding pattern until we get that finalisation. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of information on what these standards and guidelines actually look like. So under the NES, we have the standard for PM10, which is 50 micrograms of particles per cubic metre of air as a 24-hour average. And you're allowed to exceed that threshold once in a 12-month period. As soon as you exceed it more than once, your airshed where you're managing and monitoring air quality becomes classified as polluted. The NES standard for nitrogen dioxide is 200 micrograms per cubic metre, but only over a 1-hour average. And you're allowed to exceed that 9 times within a 12-month period. The World Health Organization guideline for PM2.5 is 15 micrograms per cubic metre as a 24-hour average, and 5 micrograms per cubic metre as an annual average. And the guideline for nitrogen dioxide is 25 micrograms per cubic metre as a 24-hour average, and 10 micrograms per cubic metre as an annual average. But the WHO guidelines don't include a 1-hour guideline. And just to point out that those WHO guidelines have dropped considerably compared with the previous WHO guidelines. Okay, next slide, please. So to give you a little bit of a summary of the air quality state and trends across the region, we've been monitoring air quality since 1998. We have 20 gazetted airsheds. So an airshed really is just a formalised boundary which Regional Council has identified as where they want to manage and monitor air quality. It's typically aligned with urban boundaries, and the Ministry for the Environment approves that gazetted airshed boundary. And we have monitored 14 out of 20 so far with monitoring of PM10 across those 14 airsheds. And we've started monitoring PM2.5 more recently in Takaroa, Tikoti, Taupo and Hamilton. We've also, over the years, monitored another air quality indicator, benzene, which is a volatile organic compound typically associated with emissions from vehicles. And over the years, we've seen big improvements in benzene. We've also monitored nitrogen dioxide in Hamilton since 1998 for various periods. And there is an additional nitrogen dioxide monitoring program operated by Waikato with contributory funding from Regional Council in Cambridge, Hamilton, Te Awamutu and Taupo since 2007. So PM10 exceedances have previously been identified in Tokoroa, Taupo, Tikoti, Patararu, Hamilton and Huntly. Tokoroa, Taupo and Tikoti currently are classified as polluted. Patararu was classified previously as polluted, but it's now non-polluted. Hamilton and Huntly have never been classified as being polluted despite occasional exceedances. They've never met the threshold for being classified polluted. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of insight into how Tokoroa, our worst airshed, has been compliant across the years. The graph to your left has red bars which indicate the number of exceedances per year. And what we've seen since about 2004, when we had about 37 exceedances, that generally the exceedance numbers have dropped off over the years down to perhaps a more likely average of around about 10 exceedances per year. Back in 2020, we installed a new optical type of monitoring instrument, and we've seen quite an increase in the number of exceedances. These new optical monitors are more sensitive at measuring particulate, a lot of other regional councils are following suit with their installation of optical instruments and have found similar issues around increased measurements of particulate. The good thing about these optical instruments is that they allow both simultaneous monitoring of PM10 and PM2.5. So that's one of the reasons a lot of the regional councils have moved to these new instruments. Over the years, we've also undertaken regular air emission inventories where we've basically taken a stock take of all human-made emissions, including domestic home heating, transport, industry, and outdoor burning. And we've seen quite significant reductions in emissions across the Tokoroa airshed over those years. And a lot of that has been around domestic home heating over the years, especially since 2007. We've had clean heat incentive programs, which have subsidised upgrades of wood burners. So we have seen some quite big improvements in the emissions there. Next slide, please. So since 2016, we've been monitoring PM2.5 in Tokoroa, and while we've seen on average more recently around about 10 exceedances of the PM10 standard, what we're seeing now for PM2.5 is around 70 to 80 exceedances per winter. So if that WHO guideline is adopted as a standard, it's going to be a lot more tricky to comply with compared with the previous PM10 standard. Next slide, please. So despite previous improving trends that we've seen in Te Kuiti and Taupo, we've also been experiencing some recent increases in a number of PM10 exceedances due to, since we've installed the new optical monitors there. We've also seen a large number of PM2.5 exceedances. We've had an improving trend in Te Araru, but currently we're still using the older instrumentation. We're looking at installing the new monitor there later this year, so we're anticipating an increase in PM10 concentrations, and we're also anticipating exceedances of that PM2.5 WHO guideline as well. Hamilton currently complies with the PM10 standard, but we are seeing multiple exceedances of that PM2.5 WHO guideline. Next slide, please. So looking at some of our traffic monitoring sites, Waka Kotahi's air quality monitoring program has 9 NO2 nitrogen dioxide monitoring sites around Hamilton and an individual site each in Cambridge, Te Awamutu and Taupo. And these all exceed the new annual average WHO guideline. Prior to that WHO guideline coming in, most of the sites were actually complying. So since we've got that new, more stringent guideline, we're seeing a lot of sites now not complying. A 2017 intensive nitrogen dioxide monitoring program that we undertook looked at 35 sites around Hamilton. We not only looked at CBD at locations and busy intersections, but we also wanted to have a look at those more background sites where residential areas are to get a feel for what typically residential people are being exposed to. We found that generally the World Health Organization guidelines are being complied in those residential areas, but not so in the CBD locations and busy intersections. As I said, we previously monitored benzene as an air quality indicator at 8 sites around Hamilton. And what we saw over those years is that the Ministry for the Environment guideline has been complied over that period between 2003 to 2020. And we saw a big reduction in benzene concentrations over the period 2003 to 2007, which were attributed to some changes in fuel specifications and improved vehicle technology at the time. So we've now stopped monitoring benzene. It's not really a good air quality indicator anymore. It's getting so low, it's not really worth looking at anymore. Next slide, please. So here, this is just a summary table of the last 5 years. What it indicates is that Hamilton, Tokoroa, Taupo and Te Kuiti are not complying with particulate and nitrogen dioxide guidelines and standards. And we also have Huntly, Cambridge and Te Awamutu who are also not complying with that nitrogen dioxide guideline. Next slide, please. So just looking at 10-year trends, in Hamilton we actually have 2 sites. So I've done a trend analysis for both those sites. One is improving, the Ohaupo Road one, which is more influenced by vehicle emissions. The Claudelands one, which is more influenced by residential home heating, is currently indeterminate, so it's not shown signs of improvement or decline. Tokoroa, Tikuri, Patararu, and Taupo are all shown signs of improvement. Morrinsville is indeterminate. Next slide, please. So here we have a table of the traffic monitoring sites that Waikato Tahi operates, and we have a mixture of either improving trends or indeterminate trends, and we're not actually currently seeing any worsening trends, which is one good point to make. Next slide, please. So lastly, just to give you a little bit of discussion on the implications of the amendments to the NES, which we're still awaiting on. The proposal is to introduce PM 2.5 standards based on the World Health Organization guidelines. We know that Tokoroa, Tikuri, Taupo, and Hamilton already do not meet these guidelines, but Tauraru is also unlikely to meet these guidelines. If existing nitrogen dioxide standards are updated to meet the new WHO guidelines, the current evidence indicates that Hamilton, Cambridge, Te Awamutu, and Taupo may not comply. Next slide, please. So currently, regional councils' strategy or focus has been on the worst airshed, Tokoroa. So we've had a clean heat replacement fund in place probably since about 2007, where we have subsidised low-income homeowners to upgrade their wood burners to clean heat devices. And we've funded education and awareness campaigns to get across messages about how to burn your wood, how to store your wood so it's nice and dry before the winter. And we've also sort of targeted wood merchants as well about getting messages across about supplying good quality wood. So in 2020, in preparation for the 2031 LTP process, we did put together a strategic outline case to extend that clean heat replacement funding and education and awareness campaign funding to other airsheds, as well as supporting regional plan rules and bylaws. The strategic outline case was not progressed into the draft LTP at the time due to other organisational prioritisations, and also acknowledging that the NES amendments were yet to be finalised, and we're still actually in that place at the moment. Dean King has also managed to secure some additional funding, however, for 2023 to 24 to help fund some education and awareness campaigns in Taupo due to some, well, obviously we're still not compliant in that airshed, and Tweety or Public Health have also raised some concern about air quality management in that airshed. Next slide, please. So in summary, Tokoroa, Taupo, and Tikuri are not complying with the PM10 standard or PM 2.5 guidelines, despite evidence of improving trends. Hamilton complies with the PM10 standard, but not the PM 2.5 guidelines. And Hamilton, Cambridge, Te Awamutu, and Taupo do not meet the annual average NO2 guideline, and Hamilton also does not meet the 24-hour average NO2 guideline. Some of the NO2 sites in Hamilton and a site in Cambridge are showing improving trends. Slide, please. Domestic home heating has been identified as the main source of elevated PM10 and PM 2.5, with transport identified as the main source of nitrogen dioxide. And the NES amendments, if aligned with the new World Health Organization air quality guidelines, will pose increased challenges for airshed compliance, and could mean the need to consider extending funding to some of these other airsheds to manage air quality. Thank you.
Excuse me, is that, we're at the end, are we there?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. I was waiting for the next slide. Okay, Ben, we'll start with you.
I just wonder sometimes about the bureaucracy setting the standards tighter and tighter with, because I'd like to see how other regions and other cities are going to comply with 2.5, given that Hamilton has never been in this and suddenly is. Also, with Tokoroa, if we were meeting the PM10, well, we got as best as we could with TN10 with replacing the air burners, is everyone there going to have to replace the air the burners yet again, given that they were subsidised to meet PM10 and now it's PM 2.5.
Yep. So there's some good points there. Firstly, other regional councils are finding the same issue. So there's a lot, especially since we've all started monitoring PM 2.5, we're seeing air sheds that probably may not have been highlighted as an issue before as being an issue. So we're in a boat with other regional councils, same issues and concerns. And there has been a level of frustration waiting to see how these NES amendments will come out, because we're all in a lot of uncertainty about how we might manage things. We don't know whether Ministry for the Environment will adopt the World Health Organization guidelines or make some amendments or changes to those. But the anticipation is that they probably will adopt them. With regards wood burner replacements, you're right. Over the years, we've subsidised wood burner replacements based on the old standards. The indication is that there wouldn't be, under the NES amendments, a retrospective requirement to change out old wood burners that previously complied with the standard emission standards. But as a regional council, when we're looking at strategies for managing air quality, and if we're seeing that we're not meeting the ambient air quality guidelines or standards, we may need to look at bringing in bylaws, regional plan rule to fast track upgrades of wood burners. So that is a possible option that we'd need to look at. Is would we have to go back to some of these people who have had an upgrade and look at grading again? But that would just have to be looked at other options of.
Because I noticed that in the annual plan, we hadn't fully expended the money that was set aside for Whakaroa airshed and subsidies. So
I think that was probably relating to the fact that there was Dean, you probably be able to fill in on. Oh no, sorry, you're not involved with the wood burner subsidy fund anymore. There was the previous contractor who was doing the wood burner replacements did not reapply and said that they were no longer going to do the upgrade, the wood burner replacements. And so there was a bit of a hiatus while Regional Council looked at tendering out to new contractors. That process, I think, is now complete. So, the last probably 6 months or year, we haven't done that many replacements. So a lot of that fund hasn't been spent. I think we're now in a position where this coming year we're ready to go with wood burner replacements again.
But if you're going to move to Tikawiti and Taupo, it's going to be a much increased proposal.
Yes, because at the moment I think it's $150,000 allocated to Tokoroa. So if we were looking at extending to those other air sheds, we'd need to look at more funds to do that, to really get some proper traction and improvements in air quality.
Kia ora. Oh, Mike.
Kia ora,
Kia ora.
Mike. So on your graph on page 32, you've got Tokoroa and home heating. That's quite good, considering over the many years there's been industry as well. So is this indicating that the industry that was a big contributor to air pollution within South Waikato has improved so much that you don't have to report it anymore?
Industry is a contributing factor, but a small contributing factor. So
I'm talking about South Waikato only, because that's where Kinleith is,
yes,
and that's where.
Yeah, so Kinleith is about 4 kilometres south of the airshed. So
Okay.
it does produce particulate. So there is some particulate contribution from Kinleith into that airshed. But when we look at the contribution, it's pretty small.
Okay. That's
compared
good to know.
with the wood burner contribution.
Okay. So looking at the weather and climate change, of how summer seems to be going to be longer and heat and stuff. Some of these home heating that you got in the graph shouldn't be a high factor going into the coming years? I mean, right now, the weather is quite warm, and I know for a fact that in Tokoro, the fires haven't been burning since early, maybe October. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, in what months of the year does this home heating affect your monitoring? And going into the future, what is the prediction or perception of home heating won't be a problem in some of these high areas?
So probably the peak sort of wood burning season has typically been the May through to August. That's where we see the biggest impact. That's when we start to see exceedances over that period, May to August. The anticipation is that, if we get warmer, milder winters, with higher wind speeds, we don't get as many of those cool, calm conditions. We're probably likely to start seeing less impact. So you're right, that may work in our favour.
All right. Anyone else? And we'll close off with that. Mike and Mike. And have a mover, please, for the receive the report. Robbie, seconded by Bruce. All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
And would like to thank all the presenters today. Great job, and all the councillors for contributing. So we'll move on to a karakia, please, Brent. Thank you.
Waikato. Unahia mai te uru tapinui, ia wātia, ia mama tanako, te tinana, te hininaro, I te ara takatu, ko rā hi rongo. E whakairia aki ki ronga, ia tina, omie, huie, tāhiki e.
Thank you. And call the meeting closed. Thank you.